Hey, Sabrina.
Hey.
Today's guest is none other than Marissa Conway. Marissa Conway is originally from California. She moved to London 2015-ish, and she is an expert on feminist foreign policy.
What does that mean?
It is a political framework that is centered around marginalized people and how those people's gender, race, sexuality, class, physical ability, how those are key determinants in that person's ability to access power. So it goes way beyond women, although that's where it started. The future of feminist foreign policy is looking at how all people access power and how those people's race, gender, class, how that influences whether or not they can access it. Super fascinating and something I knew very, very little about. And something that I'm really interested to hear a bunch of old white political leaders actually consider.
Yeah. I mean, right now we're dealing with our, reproductive rights being overturned in this country, and the majority of the people are old white men who are dealing with that, not considering domestic policy.
Exactly. But what was really interesting about Marissa's work, so she is the founder of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. She was the executive director for 6 years. She just stepped out of that position this year. But the conversation took a really interesting turn because we started talking about intersectionality and what it means to be an intersectional feminist and what her definition of feminism was at large, which really, really challenged me. So before I even reveal that, I want to know from you, what is your definition of feminism?
It's so fundamentally the belief that that access, that rights should be the same, right? That no one gender should be more powerful or viewed as holier than the other. That even though I recognize that this is the argument that a lot of people who fight against feminism hand me, I recognize that men and women and gender non-binary people are different. Yes, that's a beautiful thing. We're not saying that we're all the same. We're saying that we all deserve the same rights and respect.
And I don't think my definition is that much different, and we get into it today's episode. But what was really fascinating to me was my definition and reflection on feminism was very similar in that it was grounded in gender. It came back to equal rights for different genders. And Marissa really challenged me to say, this isn't about gender at all. Maybe it started there, but this is about inclusivity at large. This is about making sure that your gender and your race and your class and your ability, that none of that influences your access to power, that we all have access to the power that we want.
I love that because in my mind for decades now, I've had different buckets of social activism in my head. And it's been, here's where feminism lives, and here's where racial equity lives, and here's where LGBTQ rights live, and et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that there's a place to merge all of those is super refreshing, and it makes so much sense.
It's really, really helpful framework, and that's the idea of intersectional feminism. And we dive into all of that today, and we dive into the question of whether or not it can really show up in foreign policy. And she's a little bit skeptical. Take a listen. Marissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you. I'm very excited to be chatting with you today.
And it's evening for you in the UK. It's obviously morning here in Colorado, but we're excited to have this conversation and really appreciate you making the time. This conversation today is going to be about all things feminism, truly. And we're going to be looking at feminism and foreign policy. We're going to be looking at your career, your views. But we can't start the conversation without first better understanding what feminism means to you. So start at the beginning. How do you define this?
Oh, great question. And I think it's important to recognize that this means something different to each person. I think I take quite an academic approach, actually, to how I understand feminism, and I use it as an analytical tool to understand power dynamics. And so much of my work revolves around rebalancing these power inequalities. And yes, a lot of it is focused on gender equality, but also just kind of broader structures of power that include gender, but also look at, race, disability, ethnicity, taking quite an intersectional approach to this. So for me, feminism is very much a lens, like a pair of glasses that you put on that allows you to see things a little bit differently. It allows you to see who has power, who doesn't have power, why this is the case in the first place. Are people being silenced? Are they being actively excluded? Why is this happening? Who is maintaining power because of this? It poses a lot of questions that you then have to kind of get into the details to figure out what the context is. So I think it's this process of revealing what is hidden and what is taken as the norm, what's taken as objective. And then the second part of it that I really love is it's not a passive activity. The purpose of feminism is specifically to create change and rebalance these power inequalities. So the first act is looking at it, analyzing it, figuring out what's going on. And then the second part is taking that action and figuring out what you can do, what you can motivate other people to do to start to shift things into better alignment, better quality, I suppose.
I love that second piece of this, and I don't think it comes up often enough. I think what you're saying about feminism is not passive, feminism cannot be passive, is so important and really, really resonates. I think I look at my career and my work in global health and social impact, and certainly gender equity has been a part of that, but I don't think it was ever my driving passion, right? Like this was never the thing that I was working to solve or address. And yet the deeper you get into these spaces, the more influence you see gender equity has on everything, and the greater a role it plays in all of these power dynamics and all of these social systems and structures. And to not take action on that issue is in direct conflict with any of the bigger goals you have, whether you're trying to change healthcare or education or political reform. Like gender plays a role in all of that. Has this been the thing that was always of interest to you? Like, where did your interest in gender equity and power dynamics stem from? Was that in your household? Was that something that you grew up with? When did it strike a chord?
It's not. It's only something I discovered, I would say, after university. So growing up in California, there was definitely a tendency to think we were in a more progressive society than we actually were. And I think this kind of falls into quite a neoliberal idea of what equality means. So it's still through this capitalist funnel, which I understand capitalism as an inherently very sexist, racist power hierarchy in its own way. So I was kind of going through my teens just thinking, this is great. We have equality. And oddly enough, it was a documentary called Misrepresentation that I watched when I was in my early 20s. And it was kind of a very basic overview of sort of sexism in the media, sexism that women politicians faced in particular. And it was the first time I had ever come across something like it. It was the first time I had ever stopped to think about, wait a minute, why do women wear makeup and men don't? And it seems so silly, but things had been so deeply normalized for me, and I just never, ever thought to question it. I think this is also a product of the American educational system, where we are not taught to be critical. We are not taught to question what is objective and what is normal, rather just to accept it